Hey guys, tonight we begin with the truly bewildering, magnificently complicated, and absolutely terrifying world of medieval romance. If you thought modern dating was a minefield of mixed signals and awkward conversations, imagine trying to woo someone when your main flirting tools were astrology, religious metaphors, and the occasional dead animal wrapped in ribbon. Tonight, we're diving into why you, with your modern sensibilities and complete lack of survival instincts, wouldn't last a single day in the courtship rituals of medieval Europe. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. In the modern world, dating anxiety might stem from choosing the right restaurant or crafting the perfect text message. In medieval times, one wrong glance could result in a duel, excommunication, or accidentally proposing marriage to someone's father. You see, medieval courtship wasn't just about finding love. It was about navigating a labyrinth of religious doctrine, social hierarchy, and customs so bizarre they'd make today's dating apps seem refreshingly straightforward. Tonight, you'll discover why a simple compliment about someone's shoes was considered scandalously forward, how the scent of rosemary could either win you a bride or get you accused of witchcraft, and why timing your romantic confession to the lunar calendar wasn't just superstition. It was survival. In modern romance, we're told that eye contact builds connection and chemistry. In medieval Europe, it built suspicion, marriage contracts, or lawsuits, depending on how long you dared to hold someone's gaze. You think making eye contact across a crowded bar is nerve-wracking. Try doing it in a world where a prolonged stare could be interpreted as a marriage proposal, a challenge to mortal combat, or evidence of demonic possession. The art of the medieval glance was a carefully calibrated social weapon. Too brief, and you seemed disinterested or, worse, socially inferior. Too long, and you were essentially announcing your intentions to marry the person, challenge their father to a duel, or practice witchcraft upon their soul. Romantic, certainly, but also legally binding in some jurisdictions. Medieval manuals of courtly love, yes, those existed, advised men to gaze softly yet sincerely at their intended. This phrase sounds like something from a 14th century cologne advertisement, but it was serious business. The ideal romantic stare fell somewhere between "I deeply admire your embroidery skills" and "I am definitely not planning to invade your family's estate next Tuesday." One widely circulated guide warned men against lingering stares of the sort that cause blushing. This created immediate problems because blushing could be caused by wind, wine, excitement, embarrassment, or having contracted the plague. If a lady turned pink after eye contact, the gentleman was expected to immediately look away, cross himself, and possibly flee to another parish entirely. The church wasn't thrilled about any of this visual flirtation. Religious authorities believed that excessive gazing opened the soul to temptation, lustful thoughts, and probably gout. Priests regularly preached that true Christian affection should stem from pious admiration of moral character, not ocular seduction. Couples were strongly encouraged to keep their gazes appropriately lowered and their conversations brief, focused on spiritual matters rather than temporal attraction. If someone accidentally locked eyes during Mass, that constituted a full-blown scandal. The gossip alone could last months. They might as well have shared a tent or announced their engagement in front of the altar. Church officials took this so seriously that some parishes installed physical barriers to prevent cross-gender eye contact during services. For noble women, eye contact was a battlefield requiring tactical precision. A woman of status was trained to maintain what was called the courtly look, expressionless, distant, and vaguely bored. A wandering glance could imply flirtation, witchcraft, or severe indigestion, all equally dangerous to one's reputation and potentially one's life. Yet despite all these restrictions and potential consequences, people still managed to lock eyes across banquet halls, muddy market squares, and crowded church services. Medieval lovers wrote elaborate poems about stolen glances that lasted barely half a heartbeat. Troubadours composed entire ballads about eyes that pierced the soul, which was essentially the medieval equivalent of "she looked at me for slightly longer than social conventions strictly allowed." The medieval world had transformed something as simple as human eye contact into a complex dance of desire, danger, and potential damnation. And you thought modern dating was complicated. In the Middle Ages, there was no such thing as deodorant, cologne, or basic hygiene as we understand it today, unless you count raw panic, scattered herbs, or standing downwind of someone as fragrant strategies. But that didn't stop medieval romantics from trying desperately to smell appealing. In fact, some dating advice from this era insisted that your romantic success hinged entirely on whether you reeked of thyme, roses, or regrettable life choices. Herbs were the medieval answer to both personal hygiene and romantic seduction. If you wanted to impress a potential partner, you didn't reach for expensive cologne. You raided your garden, visited the local apothecary, or if truly desperate, pillaged your evening soup pot for aromatic ingredients. Common advice for men included tucking sprigs of rosemary, sage, or lavender into their sleeves, boots, or belt pouches. This way, every time they walked past a lady, they'd allegedly leave behind a trail of floral mystery. Did this actually mask the overpowering scent of unwashed wool, leather, and livestock? Absolutely not, but it demonstrated effort, and in medieval courtship, visible effort counted for almost everything. Wealthier suitors could afford pomanders, fancy little metal balls filled with herbs, spices, and sometimes dried citrus. These ornate accessories hung from chains on their belts, swayed dramatically while walking, and broadcast the unmistakable message, "I bathe occasionally, and I have money to prove it." Women also carried scented sachets or carefully tucked herbs into their corsets and undergarments. This served the dual purpose of improved aroma and flea repulsion. After all, romance was considerably more difficult when constantly scratching at lice bites or swatting at insects. Some medieval guides recommended rubbing herbs directly onto exposed skin, basil for boldness, mint for freshness, and marjoram for personal charm. One 13th century love manual actually claimed that thyme rubbed on the chest makes the heart visible to the beloved. This statement is either deeply symbolic or medically horrifying. Either way, someone definitely tried it. Not all aromatic choices were wise or romantic. Garlic, while readily available and undeniably pungent, sent mixed signals. It demonstrated vitality and robust health, but also made you smell like someone who lived exclusively on turnips and questionable decisions. If your breath carried the distinctive aroma of ale and pickled fish, that wasn't considered a romantic failure. That was just Tuesday in most medieval communities. The wealthy experimented with imported spices like cinnamon, cloves, and even precious saffron. These exotic aromatics were expensive enough to signal wealth and sophisticated enough to suggest worldliness. Of course, by the time you'd traveled for 3 days through rain, mud, and livestock to reach your beloved, most of these carefully applied scents had transformed into something resembling spiced medieval soup. Still, the effort mattered immensely. In a world where bathing was seasonal and dental care was theoretical, smelling like anything other than disappointment and despair was already a significant romantic advantage. Medieval courtship may have been aromatic, but it was never subtle. Medieval poetry wasn't just for artistic souls or literate nobles showing off their education. It was practically a required love language, especially for socially awkward aristocrats who had more access to ink and parchment than natural charm or conversational skills. But here's where medieval romance gets truly bizarre. The most socially acceptable way to express romantic affection wasn't by praising your beloved's beauty, intelligence, or personality. That approach was considered too worldly, too focused on temporal pleasures. Instead, you were strongly advised to compare your intended to divine figures, ideally the Virgin Mary herself. Because nothing says, "I want to court you modestly and appropriately," quite like, "You remind me of the Holy Mother of God." This wasn't considered blasphemous or weird. This was peak romantic strategy. Courtly love poems were deliberately steeped in religious imagery, partly to appease church authorities who were constantly suspicious of secular passion, and partly because medieval people genuinely didn't want to risk excommunication for being romantically expressive. Getting banned from salvation for writing spicy poetry was considered poor long-term planning. Your average medieval suitor might pen verses like, "O Lady, purest of celestial light, thy gaze more sacred than baptismal rite," which sounds appropriately reverent until you realize he's essentially comparing his crush to holy water. This trend created an entire literary genre of romantic confusion, where readers couldn't determine if a poem was intended for a woman or a monastery. Many nobles hired professional troubadours to write love poems on their behalf. These specialized bards had mastered the delicate art of crafting verses that walked the razor-thin line between romantic and legally deniable. The result was poetry that praised your beloved's hair, soul, and moral character, while carefully avoiding any implications of sinful thoughts or physical attraction. Medieval sexting, essentially, was 27 stanzas of "I admire your virtue from an appropriate distance while contemplating your spiritual purity." Not exactly the stuff of passionate romance, but it kept you out of confession and away from angry fathers with swords. Some women wrote poetry in response, often with refreshingly honest perspectives like, "I admire your courage, your courteous manners, and the fact that you actually own land," which frankly remains solid romantic criteria even today. One particularly famous medieval poem referred to the beloved as "my angel of chastened delight," which is definitely the sort of phrase that gets you left unread, even in the 12th century. The poor troubadour probably thought he was being sophisticated and spiritual. Instead, he'd crafted what might be history's most unsexy compliment. Medieval poetry offered a socially acceptable way to say, "I like you," without actually saying, "I like you." Wrap your feelings in Latin, rhyme everything with grace, throw in a psalm reference for good measure, and you could express affection while maintaining plausible deniability. If things went badly, you could always claim the poem was meant for a nun. The art of medieval romantic poetry, making love sound like a theological dissertation since 1066. Let's say you've successfully written your beloved a heartfelt message filled with appropriate religious metaphors, carefully restrained emotion, and a tactful lack of anything resembling actual passion. Congratulations, but you're nowhere near finished. Now comes the truly medieval part. You need to season your correspondence. Yes, literally season it, like a roast chicken. In medieval times, a proper love letter wasn't just about eloquent words or beautiful handwriting. It was about creating a full sensory experience, and that meant making your parchment smell like a spice merchant's fever dream. Scented correspondence was considered the absolute height of romantic sophistication and cultural refinement. While modern lovers might spritz their letters with perfume, your average 14th century romantic reached directly for the kitchen spice rack. Cinnamon, cloves, rose petals, and even a careful dusting of ground nutmeg were considered appropriate fragrances for romantic correspondence. If you were really trying to impress someone with delicate sensibilities and expensive tastes, these exotic aromatics demonstrated both wealth and thoughtfulness. According to established courtly customs, these spices weren't merely decorative additions. They were believed to convey specific emotional meanings through scent. Cinnamon represented passionate devotion, cloves symbolized unwavering loyalty, and saffron was so expensive it essentially meant, "I have significant disposable income. Please notice my financial stability." Of course, by the time your carefully scented letter had traveled in a sweaty messenger's satchel for 3 days through rain, mud, and general medieval transportation conditions, it mostly just smelled like parchment stew with questionable undertones. But the romantic intention remained theoretically intact. Some particularly ambitious lovers folded actual flower petals directly into their correspondence. Dried violets, marjoram, and crushed rosemary were popular choices. One historically documented ill-fated suitor included fennel in his letter, which was quickly interpreted as a deliberate insult unless the recipient happened to be a salad enthusiast. In wealthier courts, entire scrolls were systematically infused with rosewater or imported musk. This wasn't done for subtlety or delicate effect. The goal was to ensure the scent would smack the recipient directly in the nostrils upon opening. Subtlety was not the medieval way. Overwhelming floral assault was much more their style. The aromatic trend even extended to wax seals used to close letters. These could be scented with various oils and pressed with elaborate family crests or personal symbols. Nothing quite said, "My romantic affections are sincere and legally backed by family authority," like a seal that reeked of frankincense and parental expectations. Some medieval romantics took this concept entirely too far. Historical accounts describe letters so heavily spiced they were mistaken for medicinal recipes, magical scrolls, or cooking instructions. One famously fragrant poem allegedly attracted a family of mice during delivery, which probably sent mixed romantic signals. The medieval approach to scented correspondence. If your love letter doesn't smell like it could season a feast or cure someone's ailments, you're simply not trying hard enough. Romance in the Middle Ages was never understated, and neither was the olfactory experience of medieval courtship. Modern dating might involve flowers, chocolates, or carefully curated Spotify playlists. Medieval European courtship, however, often involved presenting your beloved with recently deceased woodland creatures, still warm from the hunt. To demonstrate bravery, masculine prowess, and excellent aim with various medieval weapons, knights and noblemen frequently gifted their intended romantic partners the fresh spoils of successful hunting expeditions. A delicate bouquet of roses was certainly nice, but a freshly slain boar's head, still slightly steaming and dripping, was the real medieval way to announce, "I think about you whenever I'm throwing sharp objects at living animals." This wasn't considered strange, disgusting, or psychologically concerning. In fact, it was actively encouraged by social conventions and romantic advice manuals. According to 14th century chivalric traditions, a man's hunting ability directly reflected his worthiness as a potential husband and provider. If you could successfully chase down a stag, wrestle it to the ground with your bare hands, and present its antlers on a silver platter, you were basically the medieval equivalent of a modern romantic comedy leading man. Women, for their part, were expected to respond to these bloody offerings with polite enthusiasm and practiced gasps of feminine admiration, even if internally they were wondering where exactly they were supposed to store their third, dead hair of the week, or how to explain the growing pile of animal parts to concerned neighbors. Some of these hunting gifts carried specific symbolic meanings that added layers of romantic complexity. A swan, for instance, represented purity and grace, assuming it hadn't bitten anyone during the capture process. Falcons, associated with nobility and power, were popular high-status gifts, although they required constant feeding, professional training, and occasionally bit fingers off their new owners. Less wealthy suitors sometimes resorted to smaller, more manageable prey. Hedgehogs, ferrets, and the ever-popular rabbit were common romantic offerings among the working classes. One historically documented lovesick baker reportedly gifted a live duck to a miller's daughter, only for it to escape into her family's well. That particular relationship did not prosper, and the duck presumably lived happily ever after. The absolute pinnacle of medieval romantic hunting gifts was the ceremonial deer presentation. In this elaborate ritual, a knight would present an entire roasted deer at a public banquet held specifically in a woman's honor. This grand gesture was typically accompanied by music, elaborate flattery, and approximately 50 other people pretending this wasn't incredibly awkward for everyone involved. Of course, this entire system assumed the woman actually enjoyed meat and had a strong stomach for blood and fur. If she happened to be squeamish, vegetarian, or simply unimpressed by dead animals, these romantic gestures could backfire spectacularly. But in a world without casual coffee shops, dating apps, or normal social interaction, a dead animal wrapped in ribbon conveyed one very clear message. I braved the dangerous forest, risked infection from wild beasts, and thought of you the entire time I was committing violence against nature. Medieval romance, where love meant never having to say you're sorry for the smell. In medieval courtship, direct compliments were an absolute minefield of social catastrophe. Telling a woman she was beautiful, too sexually forward and potentially scandalous, commenting on her lips, grounds for immediate excommunication from polite society. Mentioning her hair, extremely risky, considering it was probably completely hidden under 3 layers of veils, a wimple, and divine protection against lustful gazes. So what could a medieval romantic safely praise without risking social suicide, family feuds, or ecclesiastical punishment? Her shoes. Yes, in a world where flirtation could lead to actual excommunication or very tense dinners with overlords and angry fathers, complimenting someone's footwear was basically the medieval equivalent of shooting your shot while maintaining plausible deniability. Shoes weren't just practical necessities in medieval times. They were legitimate fashion statements that conveyed social status, wealth, and personal style. Pointed shoes called poulaines were wildly popular among the fashionable elite. Some were so absurdly long they had to be tied to the wearer's knees with ribbons to prevent tripping into moats, wells, or other people during social gatherings. If a lady could walk gracefully in elaborate pointed shoes without falling face first into a ditch, that demonstrated genuine skill, balance, and social elegance. These were genuinely attractive qualities in a potential romantic partner, and commenting on this ability allowed men to appear respectful, observant, and interested in something other than immediate sin. Complimenting shoes also offered a socially acceptable way to demonstrate that you'd been paying attention to someone without admitting you'd been staring inappropriately. There's documented advice from a 13th century etiquette manual suggesting when first you greet a lady of good standing, comment upon her garment or her graceful step, but let not your eyes wander above the ankle, lest you bring shame upon yourself and scandal upon her house. Translation: play it safe, flatter her hemline, and keep your eyes firmly focused on the ground like a respectful medieval gentleman. This strategy worked in reverse as well. Women might casually mention a man's boots, especially if they were made of expensive imported leather from Florence or didn't smell overwhelmingly of dead badger. That last qualification was surprisingly rare and therefore noteworthy. Of course, this seemingly innocent praise was actually a carefully coded romantic gesture. Complimenting a lady's shoes often meant, "I've noticed you. I think you're elegant and graceful. Please interpret this subtle signal before my father arranges my marriage to someone I've never met." And if she responded with a smile, a gracious nod, or heaven forbid, an actual compliment in return, that was basically equivalent to a modern marriage proposal. One recorded historical exchange went, "Your shoes are finely crafted, and your cloak is beautifully stitched." 2 months later, married, with a dowry including 5 goats and a small vineyard to seal the romantic deal. So yes, in the complicated social maze of medieval romance, sometimes the safest, sweetest, and most effective way to say, "I find you attractive," was to say, "Your footwear appears extremely competent." Love in the Middle Ages, where even shoe compliments could change your entire life. In the modern world, we say timing is everything when it comes to romance. In medieval times, timing truly was everything. But it also depended entirely on astrology, divine celestial order, and quite possibly the reason you remained perpetually single, despite your best herbal grooming efforts. According to numerous medieval love manuals, and yes, these existed in surprising abundance, the ideal moment to confess your romantic feelings wasn't when the emotional moment felt right, but rather when the moon was in the proper phase and Mercury wasn't having what medieval astrologers called a sulking episode. A waxing moon, that's the part where it's growing larger and brighter, was considered optimal timing for growth, good fortune, and bold romantic declarations. So if you were planning to whisper your undying devotion to the blacksmith's daughter, you'd better do it during this lunar phase, ideally while bathed in silver moonlight and holding something appropriately poetic like a rose or a moderately injured songbird. Conversely, a waning moon, the shrinking phase, was absolutely terrible for romance and romantic initiatives. Anything started during a waning moon was believed to diminish steadily over time, including relationships, friendships, and poorly timed soup preparation. If you confessed your feelings during a waning moon and got rejected, medieval astrologers would nod solemnly and say, "Yes, obviously that was doomed from the start." Some medieval romantics went even deeper into astrological complexity. You were advised to avoid the full moon if you were prone to excessive emotional displays, and to steer completely clear of eclipses unless you wanted your marriage proposal followed immediately by crop failure, public embarrassment, or inexplicable livestock deaths. One 14th century monk, who had probably never dated anyone in his entire sheltered life, warned that confessing love under a new moon would inevitably invite personal misfortune, tooth rot, and spiritual confusion. Naturally, someone tried it anyway, and was later bitten by an aggressive goose. Medieval chroniclers recorded this as definitive proof of cosmic justice, not coincidence. This astrological belief system wasn't limited to peasants and the superstitious. Medieval nobles regularly consulted court astrologers before sending love letters, arranging betrothals, or even engaging in mild flirtation across banquet tables. There are documented historical cases of lords deliberately delaying marriages for months to wait for more favorable planetary alignments, which was essentially the 1300s equivalent of ghosting someone via star chart. Of course, some medieval romantics saw lunar timing as a convenient excuse for romantic cowardice. "I do genuinely like you, Beatrice, but Saturn is currently in retrograde, and my heart must obey cosmic forces beyond mortal understanding." It was the medieval version of "it's not you, it's the celestial bodies." Still, in a historical period characterized by uncertain hygiene, unpredictable political alliances, and the constant threat of being gored by wild boars, maybe checking the sky before declaring eternal love wasn't entirely unreasonable. Medieval romance, where even your feelings had to be astronomically approved before public expression. If the moon was wrong, your love was doomed. If the moon was right, you still might get bitten by geese. Medieval dating was complicated. Love in medieval times wasn't always left to fate, divine intervention, or carefully timed lunar confessions. Sometimes it was left to mysterious concoctions brewed by herbalists, village-wise women, or your grandmother's slightly eccentric friend who kept dried frogs in her pantry for medicinal purposes. Enter the medieval love potion, the historical answer to awkward flirtation, romantic rejection, and the eternal human question, what if I could just make them like me with soup? These magical brews were rarely subtle or delicate. One popular recipe called for honey, basil, and powdered deer heart, because nothing says romance quite like organ dust stirred into your evening beverage. Other variations included potentially appealing ingredients like rose petals, cinnamon, and wine, mixed with more alarming components like ashes of burned hair or soil from graveyards. You had to be genuinely desperate to stir cremated hair into a drink and serve it to someone you supposedly cared about. Some love potions were designed to be consumed directly, others were meant to be dabbed onto clothing like medieval cologne. A few were buried under doorway thresholds or secretly baked into bread and pastries, which was perfectly fine until your romantic target bit into what tasted like rosemary, mixed with profound regret and questionable life choices. The recipes got progressively stranger and more disturbing. Historical documents describe love charms involving graveyard dirt, boiled fingernails, and the fat of black cats. Please note, no actual cats were harmed in the making of this historical content, but medieval people definitely had some deeply questionable ideas about romantic chemistry. One 12th century charm recommended whispering an incantation over a piece of bread at sunrise, then feeding it to your beloved without revealing the magical preparation, which, to be completely clear, is how you get cursed, haunted, or at minimum develop a reputation for being deeply weird. Oddly enough, these love potions weren't dismissed as harmless folk magic. They were taken quite seriously by both church and secular authorities. Medieval courts sometimes prosecuted potion makers for bewitching nobility through supernatural seduction. One nobleman famously claimed he'd been romantically enchanted against his will because a woman had worn enchanted rosemary in her hair. Sure, Harold, blame the herbs for your poor decision-making. Of course, not every love potion actually worked as advertised. Many just made people nauseous, dizzy, or mysteriously prone to writing terrible poetry. Still, belief was psychologically powerful. If someone thought they were under a magical love spell, they sometimes acted accordingly, which frankly isn't dramatically different from modern dating after 2 glasses of wine and some atmospheric lighting. The medieval love potion industry reveals something enduring about human nature. When romance feels impossible, people will try almost anything, including stirring mysterious powders into drinks and hoping for magical intervention. Whether the magic was real or imaginary, the desperation was definitely authentic. Medieval love potions. Because sometimes you need more than good hygiene and lunar timing to win someone's heart. Sometimes you need ground-up deer organs and a prayer. In the Middle Ages, love wasn't just a matter of tender feelings and gentle courtship. It was a matter of personal honor, bruised egos, and occasionally dented helmets. If another man so much as glanced at your beloved for half a second longer than socially appropriate, medieval etiquette offered you exactly 2 response options. Write a passive-aggressive poem about it, or challenge him to armed combat. Most chose option 2. It was faster, more direct, and resulted in significantly more blood. Medieval chivalry, that supposedly noble code of knightly conduct, heavily emphasized defending a lady's honor against any perceived slight or insult, even if the lady in question didn't ask for protection, even if she was completely unaware anything had happened, even if she had, in fact, looked at the other man first and started the entire social interaction. None of that mattered. Honor demanded satisfaction. The process was theatrically formal. You would stride up to your romantic rival, draw your sword with dramatic flair, toss down a glove, yes, this actually happened, and announce something like, "Sir, you have insulted my lady's virtue with your inappropriate visual attention. Prepare your spleen for violence," or words to that medieval effect. These duels of honor could range from full-scale jousting tournaments, with horses, lances, and cheering crowds, to slightly less dramatic affairs involving swords, axes, or very intense staring contests with occasional stabbing. The goal wasn't necessarily to kill your opponent. Though that was certainly an acceptable outcome, the point was demonstrating your willingness to risk tetanus and public humiliation for love. Sometimes these romantic combat situations were official events, with established rules, appointed referees, and proper audience seating. Other times they were completely impromptu and ended with at least one participant in the village fountain yelling, "I regret nothing," while bleeding from various sword wounds. For the women watching these displays, the experience was both flattering and absolutely exhausting. You could barely walk through a marketplace without accidentally sparking a minor armed conflict over your ankle ribbon, or the way you'd smiled at a vegetable vendor. Some medieval ladies tried to diffuse brewing violence by claiming sudden poor eyesight. "Oh no, I was looking at the cabbage cart, not that handsome squire's jawline." To be historically accurate, not all medieval duels were fought over romantic matters. Some were political disputes, others involved land ownership, and quite a few started because someone mispronounced another person's name during formal introductions. But when romance was the catalyst, the stakes somehow felt more personal and dramatically important. Medieval men were willing to risk serious injury, social embarrassment, and occasionally death to prove their devotion to women who might not have even noticed them before the sword fighting began. If your medieval crush was receiving inappropriate attention from other men, the culturally approved solution was simple: challenge, clash, bleed moderately, and hopefully win both the fight and her affection. Medieval romance, where love and warfare were essentially the same hobby with different equipment. In medieval times, love and war weren't just convenient metaphors for dramatic poetry. They were literally a matching set of activities. And if you truly wanted to demonstrate romantic devotion to your lady, you didn't just write sonnets or purchase expensive jewelry. You strapped on 40 pounds of armor and pinned her favorite ribbon prominently to your chest before riding off to potentially die in armed combat. This practice was called wearing her colors, and it was surprisingly common among knights and professional warriors. The tradition involved fastening a lady's personal token, a handkerchief, a silk veil, a piece of lace, or sometimes an entire sleeve from her dress, somewhere highly visible on your armor or clothing before heading into battle or jousting tournaments. The symbolism was beautifully simple. I fight for her honor, her family's reputation, and also I look absolutely magnificent in lilac. It wasn't purely romantic gesture either. It was strategic social positioning. Sporting a noble woman's colors could significantly boost a knight's standing in courtly society, earn him valuable patronage from her family, and possibly improve his chances of receiving homemade baked goods upon triumphant return from warfare. But there was a significant catch to this romantic tradition. You had to maintain your dignity and martial prowess, even if your chosen token was, for example, embroidered with daisies and smelled distinctly like her laundry. Some knights embraced the theatrical aspect completely. Historical records describe men wearing entire sleeves from their lady's gown draped across their armor, dangling awkwardly and occasionally catching on weapons during combat. One particularly documented unfortunate soul had a lady's garter tied around his helmet as a romantic favor. This was visually impressive until it slipped down during a jousting match and caused a minor concussion, which probably sent mixed signals about both his combat skills and his romantic judgment. Color choice carried important symbolic meaning that added layers of complexity to the tradition. Red ribbons stood for passionate devotion, blue meant unwavering loyalty, and green was genuinely complicated. Depending on your geographic region, green either represented hope, fertility, or the possibility that your romantic interest was secretly seeing other knights. It was genuinely risky business. Of course, critics of this custom claimed it made professional warriors look more like walking laundry displays than serious soldiers. But these critics often struggled to attract romantic partners themselves, which was probably not entirely coincidental. Some particularly devoted ladies took the tradition further by embroidering personal messages or blessings directly into the fabric tokens. Subtle notes of encouragement like, "Victory to my champion," or "Please try not to bleed out again this time." These were both practical and deeply heartfelt sentiments. To medieval outsiders, the entire spectacle probably seemed ridiculous. Hardened warriors heading into combat with delicate lace ribbons fluttering beside their deadly swords. But to the knights themselves, wearing a lady's colours was a badge of honour and a highly visible declaration. I care deeply about someone, and I'm not afraid to get mildly impaled proving it. Medieval romance, where love literally wore its heart on its heavily armoured sleeve. In the medieval world, if you had romantic feelings for someone, you didn't send carefully crafted text messages or casually slide into their social media notifications. No, you stood outside their bedroom window at night and sang loudly, hoping they were awake, that their father wasn't a light sleeper, and that you wouldn't accidentally wake the entire neighborhood with your questionable musical abilities. Serenading was considered one of the most noble and romantically impressive gestures a medieval suitor could perform, ranking just below not dying in battle and slightly above owning more than one shirt. Thus, a well-executed nighttime ballad could theoretically melt hearts, win lasting favor, and possibly earn you an awkward but encouraging smile the next time your beloved passed you at church services. The key phrase here is well executed. Most medieval suitors were not professional musicians, trained vocalists, or even moderately competent with musical instruments. They had lutes, yes, those awkward pear-shaped stringed instruments that always looked like they'd been tuned by someone having a mild panic attack. But actual musical skill? That was considerably rarer. Medieval music didn't exactly feature catchy pop choruses or memorable hooks. It was more chant-based, religious in nature, and designed for spiritual contemplation rather than romantic seduction. So what did these hopeful lovers actually sing outside bedroom windows? Love poems about lilies, stars, and eternal devotion, sometimes performed in Latin to sound impressive, occasionally in French to seem expensive, and frequently in regional dialects that made them sound like they were choking on stale bread. One historically documented case involves a baker's son in Rouen who attempted an ambitious moonlit serenade with a borrowed mandolin. His voice cracked embarrassingly on the second verse, his instrument broke completely during the third verse, and his beloved's father appeared at the window with a chamber pot. The evening did not end romantically. Ladies, for their part, were expected to listen quietly from behind shuttered windows, maybe peek discreetly through the wooden slats, and definitely not laugh audibly, even if the performance sounded like a dying goat experiencing spiritual distress. Medieval politeness dictated that they should drop some token of encouragement, a ribbon, a flower, or in desperate cases, a polite cough to indicate they were actually listening. Sometimes serenading actually worked. A halfway decent melody performed at midnight could genuinely win hearts, inspire lasting romance, and lead to successful marriages. Other times, it earned you a bucket of chamber pot contents dumped from above, which was the traditional medieval form of romantic feedback and music criticism combined. Still, to the medieval romantic mind, there was something genuinely heroic about singing your deepest feelings into the dark night, even if your only audience was a startled owl and a very unimpressed neighborhood cat. In an age without dating apps, professional moisturizers, or even basic dental care plans, medieval singles turned to nature for romantic assistance. And by nature, we mean raiding their spice racks and rubbing various herbs directly onto their faces in hopes of achieving that perfect, glowing with health and marriageability look. Yes, one genuinely bizarre but surprisingly popular piece of medieval dating advice was this: rub herbs on your face, smell like a garden, get married. The logic seemed foolproof to medieval minds. If you could make yourself smell pleasant and appear healthy through strategic plant application, surely someone would want to spend their life with you, or at least follow you around politely. Medieval love guides and herbal manuals were surprisingly confident about this approach. Basil was believed to rouse romantic affection in anyone who smelled it. Marjoram would allegedly soften the heart of even the most stubborn maiden. Rosemary was considered excellent for memory enhancement and successful flirtation. If you smelled like a walking herb garden, the theory went, surely someone would find you irresistibly attractive. Men were specifically advised to crush fresh herbs into paste and smear it along their jawlines like some kind of 14th century beard oil. Women often infused herbs into water and dabbed the mixture across their cheeks and temples, creating what was essentially medieval toner made from kitchen ingredients. The actual results were predictably mixed. Imagine arriving at a formal feast with parsley oil running down your neck and thyme leaves stuck in your eyebrows. Charming in theory, but potentially alarming in practical application. Still, it demonstrated effort and creativity, which counted for significant points in medieval courtship. Some medieval guides became remarkably specific in their herbal recommendations. One manual advised that a man should bathe his visage in mint water at sunrise, that he may appear pleasing unto all who look upon him. This sounds noble and romantic until you realize they probably meant literally bathing your face in mint, assuming you had access to both mint and clean water, which was quite a luxury combination. Wealthy medieval people used more elaborate herbal combinations mixed with rose water, imported saffron, and precious sandalwood. This was less about seduction and more about smelling like someone who didn't wrestle pigs for a living, which was genuinely attractive in its own right. The less financially fortunate made do with whatever grew nearby. Garlic, onions, or whatever herbs didn't immediately attract rats. Romantic? Debatable, but it showed resourcefulness and determination. Of course, rubbing basil on your cheeks didn't guarantee romantic success, but it demonstrated that you cared enough to try unusual beauty treatments. In a society where bathing was semi-annual and smelling like anything other than disappointment was already an achievement, herbal face treatments were actually quite progressive. This practice eventually led to entire cottage industries. Medieval apothecaries began selling specialized love salves made from secret recipes, which were essentially mashed garden clippings promising to make users irresistibly attractive. Results varied dramatically, but hope remained eternal. Medieval beauty advice: when in doubt, rub plants on your face and pray for romantic miracles. In a world where directly saying "I love you" could lead to scandal, awkward family dinners, or very tense negotiations with your beloved's father's feudal overlord, medieval romantics developed something far more sophisticated and infinitely more complicated: the secret botanical language of courtship. Welcome to medieval flower communication, where a single bloom could carry more emotional weight than an entire scroll of poetry and significantly fewer spelling errors. The system was elegantly simple in theory. Each flower possessed a specific symbolic meaning, allowing lovers to communicate complex emotions through carefully chosen bouquets. Red roses symbolized passionate love. Violets meant modest affection, lilies represented spiritual purity, and lavender essentially screamed, "I'd like to court you, but let's keep this religiously appropriate and avoid excommunication." Constructing a romantic bouquet required the skills of a diplomat and the botanical knowledge of a professional gardener. Want to express desire while maintaining plausible deniability? Send a mixture of columbine, foolishness, and carnations, fascination. Need to apologize for accidentally flirting with her sister during last week's feast? White hyacinth should handle that awkward situation. Planning to break things off gently? Yellow carnations conveyed rejection, but in a socially acceptable, flower-wrapped package. This wasn't just casual courtly entertainment. Entire medieval manuscripts carefully detailed the emotional meanings of various herbs and flowers. turning gardens into emotional minefields where every step could accidentally broadcast your intimate feelings to the entire neighborhood. Walking through a medieval courtyard with a daisy tucked in your belt announced innocence and purity. Dropping a thistle on someone's doorstep was basically declaring, "I'd rather marry a goat than spend another evening pretending to enjoy your conversation." These were serious social communications disguised as gardening. Medieval ladies responded to floral messages in kind. A returned flower indicated romantic interest, a flower thrown into the nearest ditch meant absolutely not, and a flower fed to the family livestock suggested it was time to look elsewhere for romantic companionship. One particularly famous noblewoman reportedly replied to an elaborate bouquet with a single dead weed, and a note reading, "I prefer monks." That response required no botanical interpretation whatsoever. The system became so complex that even public events embraced floral drama. During tournaments, knights sometimes wore bouquets given by ladies, not just for visual appeal, but as public statements of romantic allegiance. If you could decode the flowers, you could understand exactly who was courting whom, and how successfully. Of course, the system had obvious flaws. If your carefully chosen romantic flowers were accidentally eaten by someone's goat before reaching their intended recipient, your heartfelt message became livestock snacks. And if you couldn't remember whether yellow roses meant friendship or mild disdain, you might accidentally insult someone you were trying to impress. Still, for medieval lovers seeking a way to communicate feelings without risking social catastrophe, flowers offered a perfect solution. Romantic, deniable, and significantly less likely to result in duels than direct conversation. Medieval flower language, where even gardens had trust issues and every bouquet needed a translation guide. Dancing in the Middle Ages wasn't the casual, fun social activity we know today. It was a carefully orchestrated game of romantic chess played with your feet, your reputation, and a comprehensive understanding of exactly where you could and couldn't place your hands without causing a scandal that would echo through 3 neighboring parishes. In medieval courtly circles, dance represented one of the few socially acceptable opportunities to engage with members of the opposite sex, provided you didn't smile too enthusiastically, sweat too obviously, or heaven forbid make physical contact beyond the most fleeting fingertip touches. Even then, such contact was monitored by eagle-eyed chaperones with nothing better to do than watch for inappropriate romantic signals. Most medieval court dances bore little resemblance to modern dancing. Forget dramatic twirls, romantic dips, or anything resembling fun, spontaneous movement. Medieval court dances looked more like extremely slow-motion walking rehearsals performed by people wearing uncomfortable shoes and trying very hard not to trip over their own elaborate clothing. The Bass dance, literally meaning low dance, involved gliding slowly in carefully coordinated lines while gazing politely at your partner and silently screaming inside because you'd just accidentally brushed elbows, which was practically equivalent to a marriage proposal in some regions. Still, even these restrained interactions were genuinely thrilling. Touching fingertips during a partnered step could send hearts racing faster than a successful hunt. One extra spin during a turn sequence, and suddenly half the court was gossiping about potential engagements, while seamstresses started planning wedding attire. Medieval dancing was absolutely loaded with coded romantic messages that required careful interpretation. A prolonged gaze during a turning movement could communicate, "I admire you deeply." A deliberately missed step might convey, "I am unworthy of your affection and also terrible at dancing." And accidentally stepping on your partner's foot generally meant, "We will probably never speak again after this public humiliation." For the more adventurous, village dances offered slightly more relaxed social rules. The carol, a lively round dance accompanied by group singing, was considerably more energetic but still closely monitored by community chaperones with supernatural instincts for detecting inappropriate behavior. Music for medieval dancing came from live minstrels, bagpipe players, or someone enthusiastically hitting a drum that may or may not have been a repurposed cooking pot. Dancers were expected to move in perfect synchronization or risk public embarrassment, mild physical injury, or stepping on a noble woman's gown, which was a punishable offense in at least 3 provinces. Interestingly, some medieval love guides actually recommended observing your potential partner's dancing style as a reliable indicator of their personality and compatibility. Graceful and well-coordinated movements suggested someone worth pursuing. Wild, unpredictable dancing indicated passion but questionable judgment. Flailing around like a wounded goose probably meant they weren't quite ready for serious romantic commitment. Medieval dance floors were battlegrounds where reputations were made, romantic connections were forged, and social disasters were born through poor footwork and excessive enthusiasm. Dancing in the Middle Ages, where even your feet needed to maintain proper moral standards. You've successfully written religiously appropriate poetry, sung beneath her window without getting doused with chamber pot contents, worn her colors into mock combat, and managed not to get gored during a joust performed in her honor. Congratulations, brave medieval suitor. You're almost at the finish line of courtship. There's just one final boss battle remaining, winning over her family, particularly her father, who views you with the same enthusiasm he'd show a tax collector or a case of livestock plague. Securing a woman's heart in the Middle Ages was genuinely only half the romantic war. The other, often more challenging half, involved convincing her parents, extended family and various feudal overlords that you were sufficiently wealthy, reasonably sane, not currently excommunicated, and unlikely to get everyone killed through poor political decisions. The medieval courtship process with families was rarely romantic in any recognizable sense. It involved detailed negotiations about dowries, lengthy discussions about land ownership, and a series of increasingly tense formal dinners where everyone pretended they weren't essentially haggling over a small feudal alliance disguised as a marriage proposal. Families conducted thorough background investigations that would impress modern private detectives. Do you own sheep? Do you have productive agricultural land? Do you possess at least one working tooth? Are you currently wanted for crimes in neighboring kingdoms? These were the medieval equivalents of, are you emotionally available and financially stable? The answer to most of these questions was usually sort of, or it's complicated, which made negotiations interesting. Sometimes the woman's family demanded elaborate symbolic gifts, designed not just to demonstrate affection, but to prove genuine financial investment and long-term commitment. A modest suitor might offer a bag of grain, a well-made cloak, or a carefully carved wooden spoon. A wealthy pursuer could present horses, actual gold, or an entire pig. If you really wanted to make an impression, you brought multiple pigs and possibly a monk to explain your romantic intentions in properly religious terms. In smaller towns and rural villages, the process could be marginally more informal, but not by much. A father might judge your worthiness based on your handshake quality, your boots condition, or your demonstrated ability to wrestle neighbors over disputed property lines. Medieval romance wasn't built on nuance or psychological compatibility. Mothers presented their own unique challenges. Some insisted on testing your moral character through elaborate riddles, mandatory church attendance, or your ability to sit through extremely long family meals without blinking inappropriately. One historical account describes a mother who only approved romantic suitors capable of churning butter efficiently, practical and selective. Even if the immediate family approved of your romantic pursuit, there were still broader political alliances to consider carefully. Medieval marriages weren't just unions of mutual affection. They were essentially corporate mergers. You weren't just asking for her hand, you were requesting partial ownership rights to her family's goat pastures, and everyone involved understood the economic implications. Still, if you successfully passed their tests, proved your worthiness through various trials, and demonstrated that you were brave, respectful, and moderately solvent, they might give you a single approving nod. Maybe. And that barely perceptible nod represented your official green light to proceed with formal courtship. So there you have it, the complete medieval guide to romance, courtship, and probably why you'd be perpetually single in the 14th century. After examining the bizarre world of medieval dating, one thing becomes crystal clear. You absolutely wouldn't survive a single day trying to find love in this historical period, and frankly, that's probably for the best. Consider what you've learned tonight. In medieval times, making eye contact could be interpreted as a marriage proposal, a challenge to mortal combat, or evidence of demonic possession. Your modern habit of casual glances across coffee shops would have resulted in either immediate engagement or trial for witchcraft, probably both. Your approach to personal hygiene would have been revolutionary, but possibly suspicious. Medieval people expected potential romantic partners to smell like herb gardens, livestock, or at minimum, something other than complete despair. Your daily shower, dental care routine, and basic grooming standards would either make you irresistibly attractive or branded as unnaturally obsessed with cleanliness, which was sometimes considered a character flaw. The poetry requirements alone would have eliminated you from romantic consideration. Medieval courtship demanded the ability to compose religiously appropriate verses, comparing your beloved to the Virgin Mary, while carefully avoiding any implications of physical attraction. Your modern romantic vocabulary, filled with direct compliments and honest emotional expression, would have scandalized entire communities and possibly gotten you excommunicated. Even if you somehow mastered the art of herbal aromatherapy, lunar timing, and theological love poetry, you'd still face the challenge of medieval dating violence. Defending your romantic interest's honor through armed combat was not optional. It was expected. Your conflict resolution skills, honed through text messages and awkward conversations, would be utterly useless when faced with an angry knight demanding satisfaction at sword point. The gift-giving expectations would have horrified you. Medieval romance required presenting your beloved with freshly killed animals, preferably still warm from the hunt. Your modern offerings of flowers, chocolates, or thoughtful experiences would be seen as weak, unmasculine, and possibly evidence of hunting incompetence. And finally, the family negotiations would have destroyed your soul. Medieval marriage wasn't about mutual attraction or compatibility. It was about livestock ownership, land rights, and feudal alliances. Your romantic partner's father wouldn't care about your personality, your career goals, or your emotional availability. He'd want to know about your sheep inventory and your ability to defend property lines through physical violence. The medieval world demanded romantic skills you simply don't possess: sword fighting, herbal medicine, religious poetry composition, astronomical timing, and the ability to make small talk while wearing 40 pounds of armor. You'd be romantically hopeless, socially inappropriate, and probably dead within a week. But here's the beautiful irony of tonight's journey. Despite all these bizarre requirements, impossible standards, and genuinely dangerous courtship rituals, medieval people still managed to fall in love. They found ways to connect, to express affection, and to build relationships within their strange, complicated world. Love, it seems, truly does find a way, even when that way involves dead animals, herbal face treatments, and dueling over shoe compliments. What tonight's exploration reveals isn't just the weirdness of medieval romance, but something deeper about human nature and the universal struggle to connect with others despite impossible circumstances. Medieval people faced courtship challenges that make modern dating anxiety seem like a minor inconvenience. Imagine trying to express romantic feelings when direct emotional honesty could result in social exile, religious punishment, or armed conflict with your beloved's male relatives. Medieval lovers had to develop an entire coded language of herbs, flowers, colors, and astronomical timing just to communicate basic romantic interest without destroying their lives. The psychological pressure must have been extraordinary. Every glance carried potential consequences. Every poem required theological approval. Every gift needed to demonstrate hunting prowess or financial stability. Medieval courtship was essentially a high-stakes performance where making the wrong choice could end in excommunication, exile, or death by sword combat. Yet people persisted. They found ingenious ways to work within impossible systems. They created elaborate romantic codes that allowed for emotional expression while maintaining social safety. They transformed mundane activities like shoe compliments and herb gathering into opportunities for romantic connection. The medieval emphasis on honor, loyalty, and sacrifice in romantic relationships wasn't just cultural decoration. It reflected genuine psychological needs for security, commitment, and trust in a world where survival required community cooperation and mutual protection. When your daily life involved genuine physical danger, political instability, and economic uncertainty, romantic relationships needed to be built on more than just attraction or emotional compatibility. Medieval lovers had to prove their worthiness through public demonstration, wearing colors into battle, defending honor through combat, composing poetry that satisfied religious authorities, and navigating complex family negotiations. These weren't arbitrary obstacles. They were tests designed to identify partners capable of long-term commitment and mutual protection. The bizarre rituals we've explored tonight, from herbal face treatments to animal gift-giving, served important social functions. They demonstrated creativity, resourcefulness, cultural knowledge, and willingness to invest significant time and effort in romantic pursuit. In a world without modern dating conveniences, these elaborate courtship displays helped people evaluate potential partners' character, social status, and genuine commitment. Even the seemingly ridiculous aspects of medieval romance reveal sophisticated understanding of human psychology. The emphasis on lunar timing and astrological guidance wasn't just superstition. It provided psychological structure and external validation for emotionally risky decisions. Having cosmic permission to confess your feelings probably made rejection slightly easier to bear. The religious framework surrounding medieval courtship offered both restriction and protection. While it limited direct sexual expression, it also provided moral guidelines that helped people navigate romantic relationships without destroying their spiritual lives or social standing. Medieval romance required extraordinary emotional intelligence, cultural competence, and psychological resilience. These people were simultaneously more restricted and more creative than modern lovers. They had to find ways to express the same fundamental human desires for connection, intimacy, and partnership within systems designed to control and limit romantic expression. Their success in creating lasting relationships despite these challenges suggests something hopeful about human adaptability and the persistence of love across historical periods and cultural constraints. Before you drift off to sleep tonight, consider what medieval romance might teach us about modern relationships. Despite all the bizarre rituals, dangerous customs, and genuinely terrible dating advice we've explored, medieval courtship contains some surprisingly relevant insights for contemporary lovers. Medieval romance emphasized patience, effort, and genuine investment in ways that might benefit modern dating culture. Medieval suitors spent months or years pursuing romantic interests through elaborate displays of creativity, loyalty, and commitment. Compare this to modern dating, where people often expect immediate chemistry and instant gratification. Maybe there's value in slower, more intentional relationship building. The medieval focus on demonstrating worthiness through actions rather than words offers interesting perspective on modern romantic communication. Instead of relying primarily on verbal promises or digital messages, medieval lovers proved their feelings through consistent behavior, public commitment, and willingness to make sacrifices. Perhaps modern relationships could benefit from more emphasis on demonstrating love through sustained action, rather than just expressing it through conversation. Medieval courtship required extensive family and community involvement in romantic relationships. While this created obvious problems around personal autonomy and individual choice, it also provided social support, guidance, and accountability that many modern relationships lack. The complete isolation of contemporary romantic partnerships might not always serve couples well. The medieval emphasis on honor, loyalty, and public commitment to romantic relationships created social pressure that supported long-term partnership stability. When romantic relationships involved entire communities and extended families, breaking up required social justification and community negotiation. This wasn't always healthy, but it did encourage people to work through relationship difficulties rather than simply abandoning partnerships at the first sign of trouble. Medieval lovers had to develop sophisticated emotional intelligence and communication skills to navigate complex social restrictions around romantic expression. They learned to read subtle signals, communicate through symbolic actions, and express feelings indirectly. These skills might actually be valuable for modern couples dealing with communication challenges. The medieval integration of romantic relationships with broader life goals, economic security, social status, family planning, community standing, offers perspective on modern romantic idealism. While medieval marriages were often pragmatic rather than purely romantic, they were also realistic about the practical requirements of successful long-term partnerships. Medieval courtship rituals created shared experiences, public commitments, and community witnesses that strengthened romantic bonds. Modern couples might benefit from creating their own meaningful rituals and involving their communities more intentionally in relationship building and maintenance. The medieval understanding that romantic relationships required ongoing effort, creativity, and renewal offers valuable insight for contemporary couples. Medieval lovers couldn't rely on convenience or familiarity. They had to continuously demonstrate their commitment through fresh gestures, creative expressions, and sustained effort. Even the bizarre aspects of medieval romance, from herbal face treatments to astronomical timing, reveal the human need for ritual, symbolism, and meaning in romantic relationships. Modern couples might benefit from creating their own meaningful traditions and symbolic practices rather than relying entirely on cultural defaults. Perhaps most importantly, medieval romance demonstrates that love can flourish even under the most restrictive, dangerous, and seemingly impossible circumstances. If people could find ways to connect, commit, and build lasting relationships in medieval Europe, maybe modern love isn't as complicated as we sometimes believe. As you settle into sleep tonight, let your mind drift back through the centuries we've explored together. Picture those medieval lovers standing in moonlit courtyards, nervously clutching wilted herbs and badly tuned lutes, whispering poetry that compared their beloveds to baptismal fonts, while desperately hoping not to get stabbed by jealous rivals or excommunicated by disapproving priests. These people lived in a world that would terrify you. They faced daily threats of disease, violence, starvation, and social catastrophe that make your worst modern relationship anxiety seem like a minor inconvenience. Yet they still chose to pursue love, connection, and intimate partnership despite extraordinary obstacles and genuinely life-threatening consequences. Medieval lovers didn't have the luxury of casual dating, emotional exploration, or relationship trial periods. They couldn't swipe through potential partners, text their feelings, or meet for coffee to assess compatibility. Instead, they had to navigate complex social hierarchies, religious restrictions, family politics, and armed combat just to hold hands with someone they found attractive. But they did it anyway. They wrote terrible poetry comparing their crushes to religious figures. They rubbed herbs on their faces, hoping to smell attractive. They stood outside bedroom windows, singing off-key ballads, while praying not to wake angry fathers with swords. They wore each other's colors into actual battles where people died. They challenged rivals to armed combat over momentary glances across crowded rooms. Why would anyone endure such elaborate, dangerous, and frankly ridiculous courtship rituals? Because the human need for love, connection, and intimate partnership transcends historical circumstances, cultural restrictions, and personal safety concerns. Love isn't a modern luxury or contemporary invention. It's a fundamental human drive that persists across centuries, societies, and impossible circumstances. Medieval romance reveals something profound about human resilience and adaptability. When direct emotional expression was forbidden, people created coded languages of flowers and herbs. When physical contact was restricted, they found ways to communicate through glances and symbolic gestures. When individual choice was limited, they discovered methods to express personal preference within social constraints. These weren't primitive people struggling with simple emotions. They were sophisticated individuals dealing with the same complex feelings of attraction, desire, jealousy, commitment, and heartbreak that you experience today. They just had to express these feelings through systems that seem bizarre, restrictive, and often dangerous to modern perspectives. Their success in creating meaningful relationships despite these challenges suggests something hopeful about human nature. Love really does find a way, even when that way involves astronomical timing, herbal aromatherapy, and occasional sword fighting. Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in your comfortable modern world with its dating apps, text messages, and relatively low risk of dying in romantic duels, remember those medieval lovers who faced impossible odds and chose love anyway. They remind us that the human heart is remarkably persistent, endlessly creative, and surprisingly resilient. Love has survived plagues, wars, religious persecution, social upheaval, and even the most bizarre dating advice in human history. It will probably survive whatever challenges you're facing in your own romantic life. Close your eyes now, and let the soft medieval world drift through your consciousness like morning mist across ancient stone courtyards. Picture yourself walking through narrow cobblestone streets where the scent of rosemary and lavender mingles with wood smoke and the distant sound of lute music echoing from castle windows. Imagine the weight of history settling around your shoulders like a velvet cloak. In this dreamy medieval landscape, time moves differently. Seasons change slowly, marked not by digital calendars, but by the gradual shift of light through stained glass windows and the rhythm of bells calling faithful souls to prayer. You find yourself in a torch-lit hall where couples move through careful, measured dances, their fingertips barely touching as they navigate the intricate steps of courtly romance. The women wear flowing gowns in jewel tones, their hair adorned with delicate wreaths of herbs and flowers. The men sport fine doublets and soft leather boots, their movements graceful, despite the weight of honor and social expectation they carry. Watch as a young knight approaches a lady by the great fireplace, his movements nervous but determined. He carries a single white rose and speaks in low, respectful tones, his words carefully chosen to convey admiration without impropriety. She responds with a gentle smile and downcast eyes, the subtle language of medieval courtship playing out like an ancient, well-rehearsed dance. Let your consciousness drift outside the castle walls now, into moonlit gardens where lovers meet in secret, their whispered conversations blending with the soft rustle of leaves and the distant hooting of owls. The night air carries the scent of night-blooming jasmine and the faint aroma of herbs drying in cottage windows. Feel the romance and simplicity of a world where love moved at the pace of handwritten letters, where courtship required patience, creativity, and genuine commitment, where people expressed their deepest feelings through carefully chosen flowers, thoughtfully composed poetry, and symbolic gestures that carried meaning across months or even years of slow-building relationships. In this peaceful medieval dreamscape, there's no rush, no pressure, no anxiety about instant connections or immediate chemistry. Love unfolds naturally, like the changing seasons, with time for appreciation, contemplation, and the gradual deepening of understanding between two souls who have chosen to walk life's path together. Let the gentle rhythm of medieval life carry you deeper into sleep. The soft clip-clop of horses on cobblestones, the distant sound of monastery bells marking the peaceful hours, the whisper of wind through ancient oak trees, and the comforting knowledge that in this imagined world, love was treated as sacred, valuable, and worth whatever elaborate effort it required. Rest now in this dreamy medieval landscape, where romance was an art form, courtship was a spiritual practice, and love conquered all obstacles, even the most bizarre dating advice in human history. Let the peace of centuries past carry you gently into sleep, where dreams of courtly love and ancient wisdom await your unconscious mind. Sleep well, gentle traveler through time. The medieval world watches over your dreams tonight. Picture the bustling medieval marketplace, not just as a center of commerce, but as an unexpected theater of romance where vegetables and desire mingled in equal measure. Market days weren't just about buying bread and trading livestock. They were prime opportunities for carefully orchestrated romantic encounters disguised as mundane shopping expeditions. Young women would spend hours preparing for market day, not because they were passionate about turnips, but because the crowded, chaotic marketplace offered one of the few socially acceptable venues for interacting with potential suitors. Under the pretense of examining cabbage quality or negotiating fish prices, elaborate romantic dramas played out between vegetable stalls and livestock pens. Medieval markets operated on complex social rhythms that sophisticated romantics learned to navigate like military strategists. The morning hours belonged to serious commerce, farmers, merchants, and housekeepers conducting essential business with minimal social distraction. But as afternoon approached and the most urgent transactions concluded, the marketplace transformed into something resembling a medieval singles event with livestock. Young men would loiter near fabric stalls, pretending intense interest in textile quality, while actually scanning the crowd for glimpsed ankles or admired profiles. Women would take extraordinarily long time selecting herbs, not because they needed extensive oregano consultations, but because extended shopping provided legitimate excuses for prolonged public appearances and potential romantic encounters. The vegetable vendors became inadvertent matchmakers, their stalls serving as neutral meeting grounds where nervous conversations could unfold under the cover of agricultural commerce. These turnips seem particularly fresh today, became code for, "I've been hoping to see you here." The herbs look well tended this season, translated to, "You look beautiful, and I'm terrified to say so directly." Market day romance required sophisticated timing and social awareness. Arriving too early marked you as overeager. Appearing too late meant missing the prime romantic opportunities. The ideal marketplace romantic made 3 carefully timed appearances, once for legitimate shopping, once for forgotten items, and finally for last-minute requirements that coincidentally aligned with their beloved's shopping schedule. Of course, market romance came with significant risks. Public spaces meant public observation, and inappropriate marketplace behavior could generate gossip that would spread through the community faster than news of plague outbreaks. Spending too much time at a particular stall could raise questions about your intentions, your character, or your family's financial stability. Some clever medieval romantics developed elaborate marketplace strategies involving accomplices, predetermined signals, and carefully coordinated shopping expeditions. Friends would scout locations, relay messages through vendors, and create distractions that allowed for brief, private conversations between the garlic displays and butter churns. The merchants themselves often played crucial roles in these romantic dramas, either as helpful facilitators who arranged convenient encounters or as protective guardians who reported suspicious behavior to concerned parents. A sympathetic baker might ensure two young people happened to visit his stall simultaneously, while a suspicious fishmonger could easily ruin romantic plans with a few well-placed comments to the wrong family members. Medieval marketplace romance, where love bloomed between the lettuce and relationships were negotiated over the price of cheese, all under the watchful eyes of entire communities who had nothing better to do than monitor young people's vegetable shopping patterns for signs of inappropriate affection. In our modern world, romantic conversation flows freely through texts, calls, and casual coffee shop encounters. Medieval lovers faced a far more treacherous linguistic landscape where every word carried potential consequences, and inappropriate phrasing could result in scandal, social exile, or involuntary engagement to someone you'd barely met. Medieval romantic conversation operated under strict rules that would paralyze modern daters. Direct compliments about physical appearance were essentially forbidden. Mentions of personal feelings required careful religious framing. Even discussing the weather needed to be conducted with appropriate moral undertones to avoid implications of inappropriate intimacy. Instead of saying, "You're beautiful," a medieval suitor might venture, "The Lord has blessed you with countenance that reflects his divine grace." Rather than, "I like spending time with you," the safer approach was, "Your virtuous company provides spiritual edification." These weren't just flowery phrases. They were survival strategies for navigating courtship without committing social suicide. Conversation topics required careful curation. Acceptable subjects included religious devotion, family honor, charitable works, appropriate domestic skills, and abstract philosophical concepts that demonstrated education without suggesting worldly desires. Forbidden topics encompassed virtually everything else: personal dreams, individual preferences, physical attraction, future plans involving the two of you, or any reference to emotions not specifically approved by church doctrine. Medieval couples developed elaborate conversational codes that allowed for emotional expression within socially acceptable frameworks. "I admire your devotion to charitable works" might actually mean, "I think about you constantly." "Your family's reputation for honor brings joy to our community" could translate to, "I want to marry you, but I'm terrified to say so directly." The art of medieval romantic conversation required extraordinary linguistic creativity. Lovers learned to embed personal messages within discussions of agricultural techniques, religious observances, or community gossip. A conversation about the upcoming harvest might actually be an elaborate metaphor for hopes about your relationship's future development. Timing and location added additional complexity to romantic conversations. Private discussions were essentially impossible and socially unacceptable. All meaningful conversations occurred in public spaces under community observation, requiring couples to communicate intimate feelings while surrounded by family members, neighbors, and random strangers who had nothing better to do than eavesdrop on young people's conversations. Medieval lovers became masters of non-verbal communication out of necessity. When words were restricted, meaningful glances, subtle gestures, and carefully timed movements carried enormous emotional weight. The way someone positioned their hands during conversation, the direction of their gaze, or the length of their pauses could convey messages that direct speech couldn't safely express. The result, was a generation of people who developed extraordinary sensitivity to subtle social signals and became experts at reading between the lines of carefully constrained conversations. They learned to find intimacy within restriction and to express deep feelings through seemingly mundane discussions about community events or household management. Medieval romantic conversation, where the bread at Sunday market was particularly well baked, might actually mean, "I love you desperately, but society won't let me say so." And understanding required a master's degree in subtext, social navigation, and reading facial expressions across crowded rooms while pretending to discuss agricultural policy. Medieval society, for all its restrictions and rigid social structures, recognized the human need for celebration, community gathering, and carefully supervised romantic opportunity. Throughout the year, various festivals and holy days provided sanctioned breaks from ordinary social rules, creating precious windows when young people could interact more freely under the protective cover of community celebration. May Day festivities offered some of the most significant romantic opportunities in the medieval calendar. The celebration of spring's arrival brought communities together for dancing, flower gathering, and traditional games that allowed for unprecedented social mixing. Young women wove flower crowns, while young men competed in athletic displays designed to demonstrate strength, skill, and marriageability. The tradition of selecting May queens and kings created formalized romantic recognition within community frameworks. Being chosen as festival royalty wasn't just ceremonial honor, it was public acknowledgement of your attractiveness, social standing, and desirability as a potential partner. Harvest festivals provided another crucial romantic opportunity disguised as agricultural celebration. After months of hard labor, communities gathered to celebrate successful crops with feasting, dancing, and storytelling that lasted well into the night. The relaxed atmosphere and abundant food and drink created conditions where normally strict social supervision relaxed slightly, allowing for conversations and interactions that would be impossible during ordinary daily life. Wedding celebrations themselves became networking events for other potential romantic connections. While celebrating one couple's union, unmarried guests found opportunities to meet, evaluate potential partners, and engage in carefully chaperoned interactions. Medieval weddings often lasted several days, providing extended opportunities for courtship under the cover of legitimate celebration. Religious festivals like Christmas, Easter, and various saints' feast days combined spiritual observance with community celebration. After solemn church services, communities gathered for shared meals, traditional games, and folk dancing that brought people together in ways that ordinary daily routines couldn't accommodate. Midsummer Eve held special romantic significance, as folklore suggested that magical forces on this night could reveal future spouses or strengthen existing romantic connections. Young women performed traditional divination rituals, hoping to glimpse their future husbands, while couples exchanged flowers and tokens that carried promises of continued affection. Market day festivals, held several times throughout the year, combined commercial activity with social celebration. Traveling merchants brought exotic goods, minstrels provided entertainment, and the unusual crowd and excitement created cover for romantic encounters that would be difficult to arrange during regular market operations. Even religious pilgrimages, surprisingly, provided romantic opportunities for those brave enough to undertake lengthy journeys. The shared hardships and spiritual focus of pilgrimage created bonds between travelers, and many romantic relationships began on the road to sacred sites, blessed by the spiritual purpose of the journey. Medieval communities understood that completely suppressing romantic interaction was neither practical nor desirable. Instead, they created structured opportunities for young people to meet, interact, and evaluate potential partners within safe, supervised community contexts. These festivals served as pressure release valves that allowed romantic energy to flow within socially acceptable channels. The key to festival romance was understanding that these celebrations operated under different rules than daily life, but still required careful navigation of social expectations. Young people who could successfully demonstrate appropriate behavior during festivals proved their worthiness as potential spouses who understood how to balance personal desires with community values. Medieval festivals, where love got a holiday from normal restrictions, but never a complete vacation from social responsibility. Behind every medieval romance lay a complex economic reality that would make modern prenuptial agreements seem like casual handshakes. Medieval marriage wasn't just a union of hearts, it was a business merger, economic alliance, and financial negotiation that often determined the prosperity or ruin of entire families for generations. The dowry system formed the backbone of medieval marriage economics. Families invested substantial resources in daughters' marriage prospects, accumulating goods, money, and property that would transfer to her husband's family upon marriage. This wasn't just tradition, it was economic survival strategy that determined a woman's marriageability and her family's future financial security. Calculating appropriate dowry amounts required sophisticated understanding of social hierarchies, regional economics, and family status. Too small a dowry and your daughter might marry beneath her station or remain unmarried entirely. Too large a dowry could bankrupt the family while attracting fortune hunters rather than genuine suitors interested in long-term partnership. Medieval fathers functioned as investment managers, carefully tracking their daughters' marriage prospects like modern stock portfolios. They monitored potential suitors' financial stability, family connections, land holdings, and economic prospects with the thoroughness of professional accountants conducting business audits. The concept of marriage portions meant that weddings involved complex property transfers that could reshape local economic landscapes. When noble families intermarried, the consolidation of lands, trading rights, and political alliances could shift regional power balances and affect entire communities' economic futures. Younger sons, who inherited little or no family property, faced particularly challenging romantic economics. Without substantial inheritance prospects, they had to build their own wealth through military service, church careers, or successful trades before becoming viable marriage candidates. Many remained unmarried simply because they couldn't afford wives. Medieval marriage contracts resembled modern corporate agreements more than romantic commitments. These documents specified property rights, inheritance arrangements, financial responsibilities, and even behavioral expectations with legal precision that protected both families' economic interests. The bride price tradition, still practiced in some regions, reversed the economic flow by requiring grooms' families to compensate brides' families for the loss of a daughter's labor and economic contribution. This system recognized women's economic value while creating additional financial barriers to marriage. Widow remarriage involved particularly complex economic calculations. Widows often controlled significant property and resources from their deceased husbands, making them attractive marriage prospects, but also creating legal complications around property inheritance and children's rights from previous marriages. Professional matchmakers operated as medieval marriage brokers, earning fees by successfully negotiating economically advantageous matches between families. Their expertise in evaluating financial compatibility, social status, and property values made them valuable consultants in the medieval marriage marketplace. The Church's involvement in marriage regulation wasn't purely spiritual. It also served economic functions by preventing marriages that might destabilize local economies or create inheritance disputes that could generate costly legal conflicts. Understanding medieval romance requires recognizing that love and economics were inseparably intertwined. Romantic feelings might influence partner choice, but economic reality determined who could afford to marry whom, when, and under what circumstances. Medieval marriage, where romance met reality in legally binding contracts that made modern wedding planning look like casual party organization. Medieval medicine viewed romantic attraction and sexual health through a lens of humoral theory that would bewilder modern doctors and probably violate several contemporary medical ethics standards. According to medieval physicians, love was literally a medical condition that could be diagnosed, treated, and potentially cured through various therapeutic interventions. The four humours, blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile, were believed to influence romantic compatibility and sexual health. A person with excess sanguine humour, blood, was considered naturally passionate and romantically inclined, while someone dominated by melancholic humour, black bile, might struggle with romantic depression and sexual dysfunction. Medieval doctors prescribed specific treatments for lovesickness, which was recognized as a legitimate medical condition with observable symptoms: loss of appetite, sleeplessness, pale complexion, irregular heartbeat, and obsessive thoughts about the beloved. Treatment protocols included dietary changes, herbal remedies, bloodletting, and in severe cases, forced separation from the object of affection. Aphrodisiac medicines were extensively documented in medieval medical texts, with elaborate recipes involving exotic spices, animal parts, and mystical ingredients. Physicians prescribed combinations of ginger, cinnamon, and ground pearls to enhance romantic desire, while warning against excessive consumption that might lead to dangerous sexual overheating. The concept of uterine fury described women's supposed medical need for romantic and sexual fulfillment. Medieval doctors believed that unmarried women could develop serious health problems from lack of romantic engagement, including hysteria, melancholy, and various physical ailments that could only be cured through marriage and appropriate sexual activity. Medieval contraception and fertility treatments reflected fascinating intersections of medicine, magic, and desperate hope. Women used combinations of herbs, amulets, and ritual practices to either prevent or encourage pregnancy, often with medical supervision from physicians who specialized in reproductive health. The medieval understanding of anatomy included romantic organs and systems that don't exist in modern medical texts. The heart was believed to be directly connected to the genitals through invisible channels that carried romantic and sexual energy throughout the body. Disruptions in this system could cause both physical illness and romantic dysfunction. Astrological medicine played crucial roles in romantic health, with physicians timing treatments according to planetary influences that supposedly affected different body parts and emotional states. Venus's position was considered essential for any romantic medical intervention, while Mars could influence sexual energy and romantic aggression. Medieval medical texts included detailed instructions for diagnosing romantic compatibility through physical examination, urine analysis, and astrological chart comparison. Physicians could supposedly determine whether two people were medically suited for marriage by analyzing their humoral balances and constitutional types. The intersection of medicine and romance created opportunities for medical professionals to serve as romantic consultants, prescribing treatments designed to enhance attractiveness, improve romantic performance, or cure unhappy love affairs through therapeutic intervention. Medieval medical understanding of romantic health reveals a worldview where physical, emotional, and spiritual well-being were inseparably connected, and where love was considered both a natural human need and a potential source of serious medical complications requiring professional treatment. Medieval romantic medicine, where love was a diagnosable condition, heartbreak required medical intervention, and your physician might prescribe ground unicorn horn for better dating prospects. Medieval romance varied dramatically across European regions, creating a diverse landscape of courtship customs that reflected local cultures, economic conditions, and social structures. Understanding medieval love requires mapping the geographic differences that shaped how people expressed affection, conducted courtship, and formed romantic partnerships across the continent. Southern European regions, particularly areas influenced by Islamic and Byzantine cultures, developed more elaborate and sophisticated courtship traditions. Spanish and Italian nobility practiced complex forms of courtly love that emphasized poetry, music, and artistic expression as central elements of romantic pursuit. The troubadour tradition flourished in southern France, creating a culture where romantic poetry was both art form and social necessity. Northern European countries, with their harsh climates and practical survival concerns, developed more pragmatic approaches to romance and marriage. Scandinavian courtship often emphasized demonstrations of physical strength, survival skills, and economic productivity over artistic or poetic achievements. Long winter months created opportunities for extended indoor courtship activities, but also increased the importance of practical partnership skills. English Romance traditions blended continental European influences with local customs that emphasized honor, loyalty, and social stability. The English court developed elaborate ceremonial aspects of courtship that served both romantic and political functions, creating systems where personal relationships reflected and reinforced broader social hierarchies. Geographic isolation significantly influenced romantic practices in rural and remote areas. Mountain communities, island populations, and forest settlements developed unique courtship traditions adapted to their specific environmental challenges and social structures. Limited partner choices in isolated communities created different romantic dynamics than those found in larger towns and cities. Urban versus rural romance presented stark contrasts in medieval society. City environments offered more diverse social interactions, greater anonymity, and expanded opportunities for romantic encounters, but also increased social surveillance and reputation risks. Rural communities provided more stable social structures, but fewer partner choices and greater family control over romantic decisions. Trade route locations became cosmopolitan centers where different romantic traditions intersected and influenced each other. Port cities, market towns, and cultural crossroads developed hybrid courtship practices that combined elements from various regional traditions, creating more diverse and flexible approaches to romantic relationships. Climate and seasonal patterns shaped the rhythm of medieval romance across different regions. Mediterranean areas with milder winters maintained year-round social activities that supported ongoing courtship, while northern regions concentrated romantic activities during warmer months and developed different traditions for long winter periods. Religious and cultural boundaries created distinct romantic territories within medieval Europe. Christian, Islamic, and Jewish communities maintained separate courtship traditions, even when living in close geographic proximity. These religious differences influenced everything from marriage negotiations to acceptable forms of romantic expression. Economic geography also determined romantic possibilities. Regions dependent on agriculture, trade, crafts, or military activities developed different approaches to courtship that reflected their economic realities and social priorities. Wealthy areas could support more elaborate romantic traditions, while economically marginal regions maintained simpler, more practical approaches. The geographic diversity of medieval romance reminds us that love adapts to local conditions while maintaining universal human elements. Whether in Spanish castles or Scandinavian villages, people found ways to express affection, form partnerships, and build relationships within their specific environmental and cultural contexts. Medieval love geography, where your zip code determined your courtship style, and romance adapted to everything from Mediterranean warmth to Nordic snow. Music formed the heartbeat of medieval romance, serving as the primary vehicle for emotional expression in a world where direct romantic communication was restricted, dangerous, or simply impossible. Medieval lovers didn't just appreciate music. They relied on it as an essential tool for courtship, a coded language for forbidden feelings, and a socially acceptable method for expressing desires that couldn't be spoken aloud. The troubadour tradition, originating in southern France during the 12th century, revolutionized European approaches to romantic music. These professional poet-musicians created elaborate songs that praised noble ladies through complex metaphors, religious imagery, and carefully crafted verses that walked the delicate line between admiration and impropriety. Troubadours weren't just entertainers, they were romantic facilitators who helped nobles navigate courtship through musical diplomacy. A well-crafted song could express feelings, deliver messages, and advance romantic relationships while maintaining plausible deniability if the romantic pursuit encountered resistance or social disapproval. The courtly love tradition created entire musical genres dedicated to unrequited love, distant admiration, and noble suffering for romantic ideals. These songs celebrated the supposed spiritual benefits of loving someone unattainable, transforming romantic frustration into artistic achievement and social status. Musical instruments carried their own romantic symbolism and social meanings. The lute was associated with refined courtship and noble romance, while the harp suggested spiritual purity and divine love. Drums and horns were connected to military valor and masculine prowess, making them appropriate for songs about warrior romance and heroic courtship. Dancing and music were inseparably linked in medieval romantic culture. Social dances provided structured opportunities for physical proximity and coordinated movement that allowed couples to interact within socially acceptable frameworks. The ability to dance gracefully while maintaining appropriate behavior demonstrated cultural sophistication and romantic worthiness. Regional musical traditions reflected local approaches to romance and courtship. German minnesingers developed different styles from French troubadours, while English and Italian musical traditions incorporated their own cultural values and romantic expectations into song composition and performance. Sacred music also played important roles in medieval romance, as many love songs incorporated religious themes and imagery to make romantic expression acceptable within Christian cultural frameworks. Composers learned to blend secular affection with spiritual devotion, creating music that satisfied both romantic desires and religious authorities. The role of professional musicians in romantic relationships extended beyond performance to include message delivery, matchmaking, and romantic consultation. Musicians often served as go-betweens for lovers who couldn't communicate directly, carrying songs, letters, and tokens between romantic partners. Musical education became an important element of medieval romantic preparation. Noblemen and women learned to play instruments, compose simple songs, and appreciate complex musical performances as part of their cultural training for adult romantic relationships. The seasonal nature of medieval social life created musical calendars that supported romantic activities. Spring festivals, harvest celebrations, and winter gatherings each had associated musical traditions that provided opportunities for romantic interaction within appropriate social contexts. Medieval music reveals how art can serve practical social functions while maintaining aesthetic value. Romantic music wasn't just entertainment, it was a sophisticated communication system that allowed medieval lovers to express complex emotions within restrictive social frameworks. Medieval romantic music, where love songs were literally survival tools and every melody carried the potential for social success or romantic disaster. Medieval fashion was never just about personal style or aesthetic preference. It was a complex communication system that broadcast social status, economic resources, romantic availability, and cultural sophistication to anyone capable of reading its elaborate visual codes. In the high-stakes world of medieval courtship, your clothing choices could determine romantic success or social failure before you ever spoke a word. Color symbolism in medieval clothing carried profound romantic implications that modern daters would find overwhelming. Red fabrics suggested passion, wealth, and availability for romantic pursuit, but also risked implications of promiscuity or inappropriate boldness. Blue represented loyalty, virtue, and spiritual purity, making it safe for courtship but potentially boring for romantic excitement. Green presented particular challenges in medieval romantic fashion. Depending on regional traditions and social context, green could symbolize youth, fertility, and romantic hope, or it could suggest fickleness, jealousy, and romantic unreliability. Choosing green clothing required careful consideration of local interpretations and social expectations. The quality and origin of fabrics communicated economic status with ruthless precision. Silk imports from distant lands announced wealth and international connections. Local wool suggested regional loyalty and practical sensibility. Linen indicated cleanliness and domestic virtue. Wearing inappropriate fabric quality for your social station could result in ridicule, legal consequences, or romantic rejection. Seasonal clothing changes followed complex social rituals that supported romantic activities. Spring wardrobes emphasized fresh colors and lighter fabrics that suggested renewal and romantic possibility. Summer clothing allowed for more elaborate decoration and display that facilitated courtship activities. Winter garments focused on practical warmth, but still maintained social distinctions essential for romantic positioning. Accessories carried their own romantic messages and social meanings. Jewelry displayed wealth and family connections while suggesting romantic availability or commitment. Hair coverings communicated marital status, religious devotion, and social respectability. Belt decorations, shoe styles, and hand coverings all contributed to complex visual messages about romantic intentions and social positioning. The cut and fit of medieval clothing revealed information about body shape, physical health, and social conformity that influenced romantic attractiveness. Well-fitted garments suggested access to skilled tailors and demonstrated personal attention to appearance. Poorly fitted clothing could indicate economic limitations, social awkwardness, or lack of family support for romantic pursuits. Regional fashion differences created opportunities and challenges for medieval romantics. Travelers wearing foreign styles might attract attention through novelty and sophistication, or they could face suspicion and social rejection for failing to conform to local expectations. Sumptuary laws regulated fashion choices based on social class, preventing lower-status individuals from wearing clothing styles reserved for nobility. These legal restrictions created clear visual hierarchies that influenced romantic possibilities by making social status immediately apparent through clothing choices. The seasonal rhythm of medieval clothing production meant that romantic wardrobes required long-term planning and significant economic investment. Preparing appropriate clothing for courtship activities involved months of fabric acquisition, tailoring work, and accessory coordination that demonstrated commitment to romantic success. Clothing maintenance and care reflected personal discipline and domestic skills that influenced romantic attractiveness. Well-maintained garments suggested orderliness, resourcefulness, and respect for social conventions that made someone more appealing as a potential marriage partner. Medieval fashion as romantic strategy, where your outfit was your dating profile, your economic statement, and your social media presence all wrapped into one very expensive, very important, very complicated visual presentation. Not every medieval romance ended in marriage, family alliances, and happily ever after. Medieval lovers also faced heartbreak. rejection, and romantic disappointment, but they had to navigate these painful experiences within social systems that offered little privacy, limited emotional support, and virtually no acceptable outlets for expressing romantic grief or disappointment. Medieval breakups couldn't happen through text messages, changed relationship status, or simply avoiding someone in different social circles. In small, interconnected communities where everyone knew everyone else's business, ending romantic relationships required careful social navigation to avoid scandal, family conflicts, or lasting reputation damage. The formal process of rejecting a suitor involved elaborate social protocols designed to preserve everyone's dignity while clearly communicating romantic disinterest. Ladies learned specific phrases, gestures, and symbolic actions that conveyed rejection without causing public humiliation or inspiring violent retaliation from disappointed suitors. Religious frameworks provided some comfort for medieval heartbreak by reinterpreting romantic disappointment as spiritual opportunity. Unrequited love could be transformed into divine devotion, with rejected lovers encouraged to channel their romantic energy into religious service, charitable works, or mystical contemplation. The troubadour tradition actually celebrated unrequited love as a higher form of romantic experience than successful relationships. Songs and poems praised the spiritual benefits of loving someone unattainable, suggesting that romantic suffering could lead to personal nobility and artistic inspiration. Medieval society recognized different categories of romantic rejection that carried varying social implications. Being rejected for economic reasons suggested unfortunate circumstances rather than personal failure. Rejection based on family disapproval reflected political considerations beyond individual control. But rejection based on personal preference or lack of attraction carried more stigma and social embarrassment. Community support for heartbroken individuals varied significantly based on gender, social status, and circumstances. Rejected men might channel their disappointment into military service, religious retreat, or economic pursuits that could improve their future romantic prospects. Rejected women had fewer socially acceptable outlets for managing romantic disappointment. The concept of dying of love appeared frequently in medieval literature and medical texts, suggesting that severe romantic disappointment could cause genuine physical illness or even death. Whether this reflected actual medical beliefs or literary convention, it indicates that medieval culture recognized heartbreak as a serious condition requiring treatment and support. Seasonal patterns influenced both romantic beginnings and endings. Spring courtships that failed during summer created different social dynamics than relationships that ended during winter months. Timing romantic rejections required consideration of social calendars, family obligations, and community events that might amplify or minimize the social impact. Professional musicians and poets sometimes specialized in heartbreak compositions, creating songs and verses that helped people process romantic disappointment while maintaining social dignity. These artistic expressions provided emotional outlets that direct conversation couldn't safely offer. The medieval understanding of romantic rejection as temporary setback rather than permanent failure encouraged persistence in courtship, while also accepting that not all romantic attractions would lead to successful relationships. This perspective helped people maintain hope while developing realistic expectations about romantic outcomes. Medieval heartbreak management, where getting dumped required diplomatic skills, artistic expression, and the ability to transform personal disappointment into socially acceptable spiritual growth, because crying into your pillow wasn't really an option when you shared your bedroom with 3 siblings and a goat. As our journey through medieval romance draws to a close, let yourself rest in the quiet understanding that love, in all its complications, has remained remarkably consistent across the centuries. While the specific rituals, restrictions, and requirements have changed dramatically, the fundamental human experiences of attraction, longing, hope, and heartbreak have remained constant companions to every generation. Tonight, we've explored a world where expressing romantic interest required navigating religious doctrine, family politics, economic negotiations, and genuine physical danger, where a single glance could be interpreted as a marriage proposal, and wearing the wrong color ribbon could signal romantic intentions you never meant to communicate, where people rubbed herbs on their faces, timed their confessions to lunar phases, and risked their lives in armed combat just to hold hands with someone they found attractive. Yet, through all these bizarre requirements and seemingly impossible obstacles, medieval people still managed to fall in love, form lasting partnerships, and create families. They found ways to express tenderness within rigid social frameworks, to communicate intimacy despite constant surveillance, and to build meaningful relationships despite economic pressures and political interference. Their success reminds us that love truly is one of humanity's most persistent and adaptable forces. When direct communication was forbidden, lovers created coded languages. When physical contact was restricted, they found significance in the smallest gestures. When individual choice was limited, they discovered methods to express personal preference within social constraints. Medieval romance also reveals how much our modern understanding of love has been shaped by historical developments we often take for granted. The idea that romantic relationships should be based primarily on personal attraction, emotional compatibility, and individual choice is relatively recent in human history. For most of human existence, romantic partnerships were evaluated primarily through practical considerations: economic stability, family alliances, social status, and survival needs. This doesn't mean medieval people didn't experience genuine affection, deep emotional connections, or passionate love. It means they expressed these feelings within different frameworks and evaluated romantic relationships using different criteria than we do today. Perhaps most importantly, medieval romance demonstrates that every generation faces unique challenges in forming meaningful relationships, and every historical period requires people to balance personal desires with social realities, individual preferences with community expectations, and romantic ideals with practical limitations. The medieval lovers we've encountered tonight weren't primitive people struggling with simple emotions. They were sophisticated individuals dealing with the same complex feelings of attraction, desire, commitment, and heartbreak that you experience today. They just had to navigate these emotions within systems that required extraordinary creativity, patience, and courage. As you drift off to sleep tonight, remember that you're part of this ongoing human story of love, connection, and the endless quest for meaningful relationships. The specific challenges may have changed, but the fundamental human need for love, understanding, and intimate partnership continues across generations, cultures, and centuries. Rest well, knowing that love has survived everything history could throw at it, including the most bizarre dating advice ever recorded, and it will undoubtedly survive whatever romantic challenges await in your own modern world. Sweet dreams from the medieval world, where love conquered all, even when it required astronomical timing and a really good suit of armor. If you found this journey through medieval romance interesting and want to support the channel, consider sending us super thanks. It helps me create more content like this exploration of historical love and is deeply appreciated. If you're new here and enjoyed this sleep journey through the bizarre world of medieval dating, consider subscribing. I explore different historical periods and experiences every week, all designed to be both educational and relaxing for your nighttime routine. Let me know in the comments, what aspect of medieval romance surprised you most? Or if you were transported back to this time period, what modern dating convenience would you miss the most? I love hearing your thoughts on these historical adventures. Until next time, sleep well and dream of simpler times when love required nothing more than perfect astronomical timing, a handful of herbs, and the occasional dead animal wrapped in ribbon. Good night.